Okay, good morning. This is Dr. Rutledge, and talking today about bile reflux and the mini-gastric bypass. And having talked about it for 20 years, you think I get tired of it? I'm going to talk about some tricks and some misunderstandings and what is bile reflux. And people say bile reflux like it's a bad thing. And that's a confusion because bile reflux is normal. Many, I think, bariatric surgeons forget that you go, oh my goodness, the mini gastric bypass has bile reflux. I go, well, yeah, but so do you. In other words, normal stomach has bile reflux in it, and it happens all the time, and routinely it's not a big deal. So when people say bile reflux, I'm bothered by that. I think what they need to remember is we don't really care about bile reflux. What we're worried about are two things: bile reflux gastritis and bile reflux esophagitis. And some people get confused that all bile is bad bile and that any bile reflux is sine qua non exactly the same as bile reflux esophagitis or bile reflux gastritis, and that's not correct. And again, most people don't remember this, but there's a lot of research because the Bile-Roth2, that is the loop connection that allows an increase in bile reflux into the stomach pouch, has been around for 100 years. And so what that means is it's pretty easy to look back and see a bunch of research on this topic. And first of all, bile reflux gastritis is uncommon. In general surgery literature, it happens, and there's a pretty good, easy way to treat it, but it's just uncommon. So again, most people don't know this, especially bariatric surgeons, but 2 years ago there was a large study of the 7 best cancer centers in the United States, and they compared Roux-en-Y connection of the stomach after taking out the bottom lower part of the stomach for gastric cancer to the Bile-Roth2 or the mini-gastric bypass type loop connection. They did almost 500 patients, and what they found is really simple, and what they said in their paper and concluded is they're equivalent, they're equal. There are pros and cons to the Roux-en-Y and the MGB, but a lot of bariatric surgeons are desperately confused about the comparison. That in general surgeons' minds, there are people who prefer the Roux-en-Y, people prefer the Bile-Roth2, but in comparison studies, and in this particular study from some of the best cancer centers in the United States, including Stanford, Johns Hopkins, and others, they couldn't find any difference. The Roux-en-Y patients lost a little more blood, the operating time was a little longer, but they were the same. And if you look throughout the general surgery literature, not the frightened little Roux-en-Y surgeons who do the bariatric surgery, who are confused for a variety of reasons about the Bile-Roth2, but the general surgery literature, that is trauma surgeons, general surgeons, cancer surgeons, they routinely publish and report on using the Bile-Roth2 as part of their surgery, and they don't even give a second thought to it. The only people who are wound up and tense and worried about this particular topic are actually surgeons who don't know much about it. And we did a survey, and what we found is the less that surgeons knew about the Bile-Roth2 and gastric cancer and bile reflux gastritis and esophagitis, the more frightened and worried about it, and the more erroneous their conclusions about the published literature is. So we want to start off by just doing some basics and reminding people that general surgeons routinely use the Bile-Roth2. They routinely know that there is bile reflux, and bile reflux is not pathological. Bile reflux occurs in the normal stomach every day, and when it occurs in the post-surgical patient, what they found is the real problem is not bile reflux. It's bile reflux that's retained in the stomach for a long period of time, and this has been shown by scintigraphic studies. So they see bile going up in the stomach pouch after Bile-Roth2 commonly, and it doesn't cause symptoms, and it doesn't cause irritation, it doesn't cause gastritis, it doesn't cause esophagitis. The issue becomes a problem when the bile goes up in there and doesn't drain out easily. And so there's a bunch of surgical topics to discuss on that we'll come to, but basically Bile reflux is nothing. Bile reflux is something like Halloween, where people are frightened of the people in masks. They are not actually vampires, werewolves, witches, and ghosts. They are nothing to be afraid of. And so when you hear surgeons talk about bile reflux and their concerns about bile reflux, it's generally a lack of knowledge. And I'm probably going to make some of them angry by saying it, but bile reflux is nothing. It's a routine part of the normal gut. Okay. Now, what they would probably say is, well, I didn't really mean bile reflux. I meant bile reflux, gastritis, and esophagitis. So that's a good point. And so let's go on to talk about that topic. Again, let's look at the general surgery literature. And you find that bile reflux, gastritis, and esophagitis is rare and rarely a problem. Hundreds of thousands of people used to have the Bile-Rha-2 done very routinely because we used to treat ulcer disease as general surgeons with the Bile-Rha-2. And cancer surgeons routinely use the Bile-Rha-2 now, and the incidence of bile reflux is very, very small. You can not find many papers on it. The biggest place to find papers on it are bariatric surgeons who are frightened of bile reflux. But if we focus for just a second to say general surgeons, cancer surgeons, trauma surgeons are using the Bile-Rha-2 routinely and rarely see bile reflux, gastritis, or esophagitis. Yet, the reason I'm doing this video is a surgeon, very good surgeon, and has done MGBs. He said, oh, recently I had to repair and treat 4 people out of 400 with bile reflux problems. And notice, I hope he won't get angry at me. He said bile reflux, not bile reflux gastritis or bile reflux esophagitis. He just said bile reflux. Now, that's okay. But it's odd that here is a surgeon reporting kind of a 1% rate, which isn't bad. But we have other high volume bariatric surgeons reporting very low incidence of surgery for bile reflux, esophagitis, or gastritis. So we have the general surgery literature shows a very low incidence of bile reflux, gastritis, or esophagitis requiring surgical revision. Very low. And then we have the experience of high volume, multi-year MGB surgeons like Chevalier, Coular, myself, Hargroder in America, Paragli in America. They rarely have to operate for bile reflux, gastritis, or esophagitis. But it's odd when a patient with MGB falls into the hands of a Roux-en-Y surgeon, they commonly get surgery. And so what this talk is about is not this whole preamble that I've been through, is to explain that paradox. So let me go over it again. General surgeons, cancer surgeons, trauma surgeons routinely use the Bile-Rha-2 gastrojejunostomy. That's the MGB technique. They don't seem to have much problems. They don't seem to have a lot of published papers. They're doing it in elderly cancer patients routinely, and they don't seem very tense about it. We know that large volume, long-term MGB surgeons rarely see bile reflux problems such as gastritis and esophagitis that require surgery. So Carbajo, Coular, Chevalier, Musella in Italy, all these surgeons are reporting very low incidence of bile reflux complications that lead to surgery. Yet, I have had many of my patients, they throw up bile once or twice or even more often. If they see a Roux-en-Y surgeon, they get an operation. And so I'm going to say in a polite and respectful way, there's a reason for that. It's because they don't know what they're doing. Let me restate that. Okay. Well, let's see. When patients come to me with symptoms that could be related to bile reflux, gastritis, or esophagitis, then I have a process of dealing with that that might be helpful if you're a patient or if you're a Roux-en-Y surgeon and you'd like to maybe not do so many Roux-en-Y conversions of MGB. Actually, I think that Roux-en-Y surgeons might get a lot of joy out of the conversion of MGB because they kind of chuckle and say, ah, this shows Rutledge was wrong. But anyways, let's go through it. First of all, what are the symptoms potentially of, quote, bile reflux gastritis, and bile reflux esophagitis? Well, there's a general term for this called dysphagia. Dysphagia just means you have an upset stomach. You may actually vomit bile. You may have severe abdominal pain. You may have burning pain. You may have that kind of reflux pain. You may have nausea, vomiting, all kinds of symptoms. Okay, and what we'd like to say first of all is the research studies in Roux-en-Y and the MGB show the most common symptom of an upset stomach or dysphagia in Roux-en-Y patients and MGB patients is what we call gastritis or marginal ulcer. Okay. Now, in a confused or poorly educated or not very knowledgeable surgeon, if an MGB patient comes to him, gets endoscopy, has gastritis at the junction between the stomach and the bowel, and they see a little bile, they say, aha! Bile reflux caused this ulcer. Which, you know, it's possible, I guess. But it turns out that the incidence of marginal ulcers in Roux-en-Y, where there's no bile, or almost no bile, is between 3 and 20%, depending on the study and how they're followed. And most people would say, and I think it's reasonable, that Roux-en-Y patients suffer a rate of marginal ulcer, gastritis, that's around 5%. And it varies depending on your country, how many smokers you have, because more smokers and more NSAIDs, you know, aspirin and Motrin and things like that, increases the risk of marginal ulcer. So bile, not present in Roux-en-Y. Marginal ulcer, gastritis on endoscopy, perforated ulcers, etc., happens in the Roux-en-Y with no bile at a rate around 5% in my series in the United States. And in Dr. Chevalier's series in France. And then it's much lower in Dr. Kular's series in India. And maybe now we can explain that. So let's go through this again because it's complicated, but it'll help you understand if you can understand this. First of all, a lot of poorly informed bariatric surgeons are frightened of bile reflux causing gastritis. And they could see a patient post MGB who has gastritis, and they will say, aha, this is bile reflux gastritis, because the MGB has bile. And the Roux-en-Y, though, interestingly, has no bile, but has a connection between the stomach and the intestine. And the incidence of ulcers and gastritis on endoscopy, depending on the study, is around 5%. Some a little less and some a lot more, but I'm going to just say around 5%. But there's no bile. Now let's look at the MGB patients. For my patients, they got bile. And the incidence of marginal ulcer and gastritis is about 5% with bile. Okay, wait for it. Let me do that again. This is hard for the Roux-en-Y surgeons to understand. If you connect the stomach to the bowel with a Roux-en-Y, the incidence of marginal ulcer is about 5%. If you connect the stomach to the bowel with the Bile-Roth 2, the incidence of marginal ulcer is around 5%. One has bile and one doesn't have bile. Wait for it. Wait for it. Oh, probably the bile makes no difference. Wait, let me say it again. Probably the bile makes no difference. Probably the bile makes no difference. Because what's causing the marginal ulcer? the thing that always causes ulcers, which is acid peptic disease. In other words, it's acid in the stomach, not bile, because one with bile, one without bile makes no difference in the overall rate of ulcers. I'll say it again because people get really confused about this. They get all tense and they say, here's an MGB patient. He has bile and he's got an ulcer. It must be the bile. But if they had a Roux-en-Y patient that had an ulcer, they say, it must be acid. Okay. Now, I also mentioned something else interesting that, again, not everybody knows. But if there's a surgeon who has put up with me this far, you might be interested, because what we found is very clear, which is in India, the rate of marginal ulcer is much lower than in France and America. And the reason is smoking. More smoking, more marginal ulcers, because it's associated with acid peptic disease, and smoking and NSAIDs and steroids increase the risk of perforated ulcers and marginal ulcers, etc. Now, if you have a marginal ulcer in an MGB patient, will it help to cut that and convert it to a Roux-en-Y? Well, I would say probably not, probably for a short time. But you're creating an operation that's exactly the same risk long-term if they continue smoking, for example, as if they had their MGB. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And we'll talk about treatment of that a little bit later. Now, the other thing is, what if you get somebody who has esophagitis after MGB? Well, our studies show that's very rare. So we're not going to talk too much about that. Our studies show patients with severe damage to the lower esophagus with esophagitis, and even Barrett's can have it reversed. And Dr. Carbajo shows almost 100% reversal, and Dr. Coular and my results all show that the MGB is very effective in treating and reversing esophagitis. And we won't get into a big fight about that right now. So again, what we find is people who have minimal or low experience with MGB, and they're faced with somebody with dysphagia and gastritis, they get confused. And they say, it's the bile. Okay, now there's another trick that's important to understand. And again, I think most of the bariatric surgeons I talk to, including a lot of MGB surgeons, don't understand the next topic I want to talk about. So this is going to take a little bit of time, and let me work through it, but say every patient who has an MGB or a loop connection can be made to vomit bile easily. Okay, let me say that again. I can make every single patient with an MGB or a Bile-Reflux vomit bile easily. Anytime I want to, I can induce biliary vomiting, where you vomit green bile at any moment. So if I have a competitor, say in another county that's doing MGB, and I want to make him look bad, I can go and get all of his patients to return to him vomiting bile. I can make all of them return vomiting bile. And he's going to be, oh my goodness, this MGB is a problem, and look at all my patients. And so every patient with a Bile-Reflux can be made to vomit bile at any time. I can do it easily. Oh, okay. Imagine that I had a magic way to reach in and pinch the gut. Okay? Imagine I could grab the intestine and pinch it closed. If you remember how the MGB is created, there is a connection between the stomach and the bowel, and the liver dumps bile along with the gallbladder into the duodenum, the beginning of the intestine. It runs downstream, and as it's running downstream through the intestine on the interstate on its way to the colon, it passes an on-ramp on its right-hand side as it's heading south, and that on-ramp is the stomach entering the bowel about 2 meters, 6 feet distal beyond the beginning of the intestine. Okay, so bile comes from the liver and the gallbladder. It's dumped into the small bowel at the beginning. It starts running downstream. And as it's heading down to your colon through the long 30-some feet of bowel, it passes a new on-ramp. That's the MGB. At the new on-ramp, usually it stops for a second, maybe goes up in there for a second, realizes that's not where it wants to go, and heads south. Okay? But let's suppose I reach in there and pinch the highway closed. Let me say it again. Bile's coming down, heading down normally, every day, in and out, goes down, passes the on-ramp, the connection between the stomach and the bowel. Might go up there for a second. That's called bile reflux. And remember, no problem having bile reflux. No problem with bile reflux. There's no problem with bile reflux. As long as it comes right back out and says, no, I'm not supposed to be here. I'm heading south. I'm going to the colon. Now I pinched it shut. What happens? Right. Bile builds back up into the gastric pouch. And depending on how long it's plugged up and how bad it is, it can come back into the stomach. And even imagine then if you lay down. Let's suppose I pinched it off and bile is trickling in. And now I pinched it off and then you lay down or stand on your head. All of a sudden, every MGB, every Bile tube patient with gastric cancer will suddenly start to have bile reflux back up into the stomach and into the esophagus and maybe even vomit it or get it back in the lungs. So what is our take-home message here? Don't let anybody pinch your intestine. Closed. That's a bad thing. But it's very easy to get that exact same roadblock effect. In the MGB, the food is dumped directly down the esophagus. You swallow it. 1-2 seconds. It hits the small new gastric pouch, which is designed to be exactly like the esophagus. And so another 1 to 2 seconds, it's into the small intestine. Now, this intestine is interesting because it's floppy. It doesn't move stuff through very fast. And so if you swallow the right or wrong kinds of foods, you can cause a blockage. And my patients who are watching this, they already know what to do. If you want to cause a blockage, eat a big piece of bread. It's like swallowing a sponge. Eat a big bowl of spaghetti. Eat a big bowl of rice. Eat a big bowl of meat and other kind of foods like potatoes. If you eat too fast or too much, all of that will go down. It'll drop through the esophagus. It'll drop through the stomach pouch into the small intestine. And if you put a bunch of that, if you eat, and you'll get a partial plug. It's like plugging up the drain of a bathtub. Do I need to tell you what happens next? Just like pinching it closed, bile will build up. So imagine this. If I want to cause all of my patients who have MGB to vomit bile tonight, I would say at 10 o'clock, eat a bowl of spaghetti with some garlic bread. At about midnight, they'll be lying there and suddenly they'll be vomiting bile. So what's the treatment for that? A Roux-en-Y? Of course, you can do a Roux-en-Y. Roux-en-Y is not without its own problems. But what we're saying is really simple, which is don't do that. So here's my choice. If you're having trouble with bile reflux, you can do a Roux-en-Y. And one of the nice things about the MGB, if you ever want a Roux-en-Y, you can have it. But you could also not eat a bowl of spaghetti at midnight. And so what we're saying simply is the first thing we do when patients come to me and they say they're vomiting bile or they have dysphagia is we do what's called a diet history form. And so I get calls from all over the world, from doctors and patients, and they say, oh, my patient has dysphagia or nausea, vomiting bile. And I say, okay, the first thing what we want is 7 days of a meticulous 24 hours, careful description of every single thing you eat, what time you get up, when you eat it, how much you eat, day in and day out for 7 days. And we want to know all the medicines you're taking. And we want to know all the crazy supplements you might be taking. We want to know your activities. Are you doing any exercise? Or you just sit at your job all day? All kinds of things like that. And here's what we find. Never need to do a Roux-en-Y. Never, never, never need to do a Roux-en-Y. Most of the patients around the world who call me, when they do the 7 days, they find out, obviously, what they're doing wrong, and they don't even get back in touch with me unless I chase them down. I had a patient who used to work for me, and she called and said, you know, they diagnosed her with all this problem and that problem and endoscopy and all that stuff, and I told her to do all the things I did, do a diet history and this and this. And she sent me her diet history, and she was eating terribly. She had 6 large-scale junk food meals a day, and MGB, you can't have that. It causes a blockage and nausea and vomiting, and the stomach can't empty quickly, and stuff sits around, and all kinds of problems. So the diet you're supposed to eat after MGB, which you must follow or the MGB really will punish you, is 6 small feedings, and it's like the Mediterranean type diet or a post-gastrectomy syndrome diet. There's a lot of other issues for eating it well as opposed to poorly. And so my suggestion is a really good MGB surgeon should do this first or call me first, and you'll never have to do a Roux-en-Y. Doing a Roux-en-Y, in most cases, in my opinion, and I'm biased, means you don't know what you're doing. Because MGB rarely has that problem. General surgeons rarely have that problem. Trauma surgeons rarely have that problem, and oncologic surgeons rarely have that problem. If they had it a lot, they wouldn't be doing it. The people who have that problem are those people who are inexperienced with performing and managing patients with this, and understanding in particular, everybody will vomit bile. And if you have gastritis, it's most likely caused by acid, and converting it to a Roux-en-Y doesn't help because they get the same rate of marginal ulcer. Anyways, there's a lot more to it than that. I'm just going to summarize it. This has gone a little longer than I expected. And thank you all for listening. Take care.